In this demonstration, you're going to see how to configure just enough administration on Windows Server 2022. So I'm starting here on a domain controller, and this domain controller hosts a DNS server. I'm going to log in as Prime, who has domain administrator privileges. So I sign in as Prime. We can see that the local server name is TWTDC. And what I'm doing is I'm opening Windows PowerShell ISE, and I'm opening it with administrative privileges. So what I'm doing here is I'm changing to the C program files Windows PowerShell modules folder. I'm creating a directory in this folder called DNSOps. I'm changing into the DNSOps directory. I'm then creating a new module manifest of the name DNSOps. I create a role capabilities folder. I change into the role capabilities folder. And then I create a role capability file called DNSOps. What I then do is I open up ISE on that file. So in this file, I'm going to configure the settings of this environment. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to specify which commandlets will be available in this JEA session. So we've got restart service as a commandlet available. Next, we do functions. In the case of DNS, most of the operations you would perform in PowerShell are functions rather than commandlets, and you do need to know the difference when you're setting this up. So here I'm using add DNS server resource record, clear DNS server cache, get DNS server resource record, remove DNS server resource record as available functions. So it's very limited DNS administration functionality. I'm allowing the whoami command to be used within this JEA session. I save that file. So now that we've configured what you can do, we need to configure a session configuration file that specifies who can do it. So I create that session configuration file with a new PS session configuration file commandlet. I then open that file in ISE. So here I'm scrolling down and I'm going to configure the session type, and I'm going to make this a restricted remote session. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to configure this session so it uses a virtual account rather than the account someone connects with. Then I'm going to specify the role definition. So here I'm saying that the security group that can access this endpoint is the DNSOps security group, and the role capability file associated with this is the DNSOps role capability file I created previously in ISE that specified those commandlets and functions. So once I've done that, I save that file. Then what I do is I use those two files to register the appropriate endpoint. So I register an endpoint named DNSOps. I specify the session configuration file. It then goes and registers that endpoint, and then I need to restart the WinRM service. That means that that endpoint becomes available. And I can verify that that endpoint becomes available by using the get PS session configuration commandlet. And if I scroll back up here, I can see that DNSOps is now registered. So what I do now is I'm going to switch across to a management server. And I'm going to sign in with my domain admin credentials just to show you what this looks like from a remote connection. So I open up PowerShell. I establish a standard remote PowerShell session to the domain controller. And that computer name is TWTDC. And the first thing I do is I check how many PowerShell commands are available in this session. And we see it's 2,167. And then I can run a whoami. And it comes back and says, well, your Tailwind Traders Prime, because I am connected using a standard remote PowerShell session. So I exit that session and I'm going to sign off. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign in with a user account that's got no administrative privileges whatsoever, other than being a member of that DNS ops group, which is just a standard security group that just happens to be associated with those JEA configurations. So I sign in as Oren, I put the password in, I open up PowerShell, and here I say enter PS session, I specify the domain controller, but then I specify the name of the remote JEA endpoint. So connect to DNS ops. Now I'm authorized to do so because Oren's a member of that group. And here I say, tell me how many commands I've got accessible to me. And it says I've only got 13. So rather than 2,000, I only have 13 accessible to me. And that's before we even worry about whether or not I've got permissions to run that. But because we set this up with that special virtual user, I've got local admin privileges for those 13 commands. So I can only do 13 things, but I can do them with administrative privileges. So if I run Who Am I, we see that it's a virtual user, that I'm not logged in as far as the domain controller is concerned as Tailwind Traders Oren. So let's do some operations against the DNS server. First, let's view all of the DNS resource records in the zone tailwindtraders.com. And we do that and we see we've got Jupiter, Mars, Mercury, Neptune, Saturn, Uranus and Venus. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new resource record. We're going to add a DNS resource record for Pluto to that zone because we've got permission to use those commandlets. And we're a local administrator, which allows us to write to the DNS zone. So we add Pluto and we specify the IPv4 address of Pluto. We press enter. We run the show us all of the resource records and we can see that the Pluto record is present. Now we had some other things that we configured that we could do. We said that we would allow the restart service commandlet, but only for the DNS service. So we can restart DNS, but if we try to restart something else like WinRM, we get an error. So we've limited what can actually be done in that remote session. Anyway, in that demonstration, you saw how to configure and operationalize just enough administration on Windows Server 2022.